I'd like to acknowledge the Palawa peoples on whose country I live and work, and the Whadjuk people on whose country I stand today, and I pay my respects to their ancestors and elders, past, present and emerging. I'm sorry I can't join you in person, but I've tested positive to COVID. I was hoping to discuss the ideas in this presentation with you, but also to talk about my work with the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre on the beautiful island of Lungtalanana. We're planning to repatriate wombats, wallabies, potoroos and other culturally important and conservation significant species. So if you'd like to know more about Lungtalanana, I'll include a link to a short film at the end of this talk. Otherwise, please have a chat to Rob Brewster from WWF Australia, who's running around at this conference. Anyway, thanks for your patience. I've been thinking through the potential and the limitations of rewilding in Australia with my co-authors, Freya Matthews from La Trobe and Chris Johnson from the University of Tasmania. I'd like to put forward some reasons why I think rewilding principles have a place in Australia and how they might be placed in the service of First Nations-led conservation. Now, there are many versions of rewilding, but I'll focus on the original version, developed in the 90s in the USA by activists and scientists like Michael Soule, Reid Noss and David Foreman. In the pages of Wild Earth magazine, they articulated their vision for a network of core habitats connected by wildlife corridors stretching thousands of kilometres across North America, big enough for elk, bears, wolves and bison to roam free. This movement started as a synthesis of wilderness protection activism, the new science of conservation biology, and a healthy disrespect for industrial interests. And some of the principles of this original vision are entirely appropriate here and now in Australia. I'd like to draw your attention to 4 of them. Firstly, it was ambitious. They hoped to protect wilderness at the continental scale. We also need to be ambitious, with positive stories of renewal and reconnection at the landscape scale. Rewilding was about protecting animals and their ecological and cultural agency. As you're all aware, Australian landscapes have been robbed of their fauna and all the help those animals give in maintaining and restoring ecosystems. We've been robbed of our diggers like bandicoots and bettongs and regulators like dingoes and our seed dispersers like emus. We need them back. Third, early rewilding was collaborative. The Wildlands Network empowered citizens and community groups to participate in regional planning. Lastly, rewilding put humans in our place, ethically speaking. It rejected the view that nature is there merely as a resource for us and instead placed nature first. Today, there's a tendency to take on business-friendly language, the anthropocentric language of natural resources, ecosystem services, sustainability and efficiency. I think that language belies a worldview that is not just plain wrong, but also undermines conservation in the long run. These 4 principles can work for Australian conservation and restoration, but there's a problem. There was a glaring hole in early American rewilding. They made almost no reference to First Nations peoples and their land care practices. In one article, for example, Howie Walker lists American Indians alongside endangered animals. In another, Reid Noss toys with the idea of eliminating all possible traces of human influence. The discussion about First Nations people was often just limited to the role of humans in driving Pleistocene megafauna to extinction. Pretty soon, those early architects of rewilding came under attack for this oversight, along with their wilderness ideal. One of the more powerful criticisms was that wilderness protection was just another cog in the machine of colonial logic, working to elide Indigenous histories and rights. In 1994, for example, Australian Aboriginal scholar Fabienne Bayer wrote that conceptions of wilderness and conservation are yet another form of paternalism and dispossession if they continually to conceptually remove Aboriginal people from the Australian landscape. The early architects of rewilding had made a big mistake, envisioning a landscape without people, and that mistake has been compounded by later rewilding advocates, particularly in Europe, where it's come to mean a hands-off approach to restoration. Now, I don't think we have to make the same mistake here in Australia. I think we can take on some of the key principles of rewilding in ways that support Indigenous community-led restoration. In a minute, I'll give some examples, but first I'd like to speak about Indigenous-led conservation here in Australia. It's important to pause for a minute and note that I'm not Indigenous and I don't speak for any First Nations people. I'm a conservationist reflecting on our practices and doing my best to make sure those practices support Indigenous communities. I just want to make clear that community is best placed to tell their stories. And more I'm seeing that opportunity being realised. In Australian conservation, there's been a sea change in conversations amongst and with First Nations people. Environmental NGOs, government departments, universities and corporations are all looking to partner with Indigenous groups for restoration. Conservation is increasingly drawing upon First Nations framings for environmental problems, goals and solutions. One reason for supporting traditional owners is quite pragmatic. In Australia, 40% of all terrestrial protected areas and ecologically intact landscapes are owned or managed by Indigenous communities. Without their consent, restoration is not possible. Without their leadership and governance, it's much more likely to fail. Conservation science is also becoming more aware of the consequences of removing First Nations stewards from their lands. Michael Soule Fletcher's recent analysis of trees and soil in Tasmania's Surrey Hills is a good case study. As one Australian NGO has put it, country needs people. If rewilding means places without people, if it means minimising all kinds of human influence, or if it means promoting wilderness, then it has no place in Australian conservation. But I think that rewilding is adaptable enough that it can bring something unique and positive to Australian conservation. So to do that, I suggest focusing on the 4 principles I mentioned. When we're thinking about restoration projects, we can be ambitious, painting visions of restoration and reconnection at huge scales, with hands-on participation by the communities that live in those places. We can recognise that animals are important, culturally and ecologically. People understand that they're important. People understand how they operate to restore landscapes. Third, let's make sure rewilding projects are creative, participatory, and collaborative, that they bring local people along. Collaboration should be embedded in project governance and planning right from the start. And we can take this idea of creative collaboration further than just the human community. One of the defining principles of rewilding is that it is working with nature, working with our fellow creatures in the ecological community, supporting their autonomy and agency. Nature-based solutions are sometimes framed just in this way. At its best, rewilding makes restoration into a creative collaboration with those agents. Lastly, a collaborative approach means challenging reductive, anthropocentric thinking in terms of nature as just a material resource. One of the reasons that a framing in terms of healthy country is so important is that it gives the community a clearer reason for restoring ecosystems. I'd like to finish with 3 examples where these principles appear evident, at least to me. In 2002, Keith Bradby and others formed Gondwana Link, an ambitious regional collective here in Western Australia in the southwest corner. They aim to reconnect 1,000 kilometres of country from the wet forests and heathlands of the southwest to the Great Western Woodland in the arid east. From the early days, Gondwana Link acted as a coordinating hub so that local groups could participate and collaborate in an organic way, making their own arrangements amongst themselves. 2 decades later, they've purchased 16,000 hectares of property, they've restored 13,000 hectares of marginal farmland, and they've also secured huge areas with conservation covenants. Gondwana Link operates on the traditional countries of the Noongar, Gudju and Wongai people. It supported the Gudju people in their successful bid for native title over 4.4 million hectares of the Great Western Woodlands. It also supports local Aboriginal communities to build capacity for healthy country planning, and it facilitates the transfer of land title to ownership by traditional owners. The second example is the draft Golden-Shouldered Parrot Recovery Plan. It's a restoration program led by traditional owners that shares a lot with the rewilding paradigm. The golden-shouldered parrot is a totem for the old Kola and other traditional owners of the area, for their elders and ancestors. The parrots were widespread through the Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, but they declined as people were taken off their country. Traditional owners and ecologists have identified a complex web of relations between parrots and other animals, vegetation structure, seed availability, and people on country. The parrots feed on grass seeds and they nest in termite mounds in open vegetation. And in this system, dingoes help parrots by reducing grazing pressure by their herbivorous competitors. Dingoes also disrupt the predatory behaviours of smaller species like cats, and they're seen as protectors of the parrots. The agency of dingoes in this system represents just one knot in a complex web of relations. And in a lesson for rewilding, that web includes humans. For example, burning in the right way increases the seed that's available to the parrots in the early wet season. One more example and we're done. Mana Bangara was originally conceived as a rewilding project after 10 years of community action planning on the York Peninsula in South Australia. Inspired by rewilding in the USA and Europe, a consortium of traditional owners, landholders, NGOs and governments is collaborating to reintroduce mammals to the peninsula, beginning with ecological engineers. The scale of the project is enormous, covering about 170,000 hectares. Early proponents hope to reintroduce dozens of animal species to the peninsula, but for the moment, Mana Bangara is focused on 4. The first of these is the brush-tailed bettong, known as yalgi in the Narungga language. More than 100 yalgi have been introduced to the peninsula in the last few years. They're ecological engineers. They turn over soil and create pits in the soil surface as they forage, which collect seeds and moisture. They disperse mycorrhizal fungi, which promotes the restoration of vegetation. In the language of the traditional custodians of York Peninsula, Mana Bangara means healthy country or prosperous country. For these people, returning missing mammals does not just restore ecosystems, but it also restores cultural practices and relationships. The animals clearly have both cultural and ecological agency. To wrap up, I see a lot to inspire us in rewilding. Even if we don't take on the language of rewilding, and some of my Aboriginal colleagues have strong feelings about that, I think that we can still take lessons from it. We can be ambitious. We can aim for big, long-term and inclusive conservation. We can pay attention to the agency of animals in the landscape, not just their ecological agency, but their cultural agency as well. We can support Indigenous communities by following their lead, avoiding anthropocentric framings of restoration and thinking in holistic and relational ways in terms of community and culture. Lastly, we can think of our restoration practices not in a top-down controlling way, but instead as creative collaborations with the more than human community. As I said, this is a work in progress and I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please get in touch if you'd like to have a chat about it. Thank you very much.